We are continuing our study of Shabbat, and we need to start getting into some applications. And we'll start off slow. The first one, first application is starting a fire. We have the command that says you're not supposed to start a fire on Shabbat. Okay, so this means that if you're going to do any kind of slow cooking or heating or something like that on Shabbat, then the fire has to be turned on prior to Shabbat. Okay, now this applies directly to a wood fire in a wood stove, right? Obviously. Does this apply to a gas fire or a gas stove? Well, it's actually starting a flame, and so I would say yes, definitely it applies to a gas stove. Okay, well, does this apply to an electric stove? My thinking is, what's the difference between turning a dial on a gas stove and turning a dial on an electric stove? I don't see any difference in that other than the fact that you don't have an actual open flame. There is heat being made by the electricity. Would that be considered a fire? I think so. But may not get agreement from everybody in the congregation on that. So does an electric stove apply? That probably is going to be left to your personal interpretation. I think it does, but if you can't get agreement in your congregation on this, then you're going to have to leave it to personal application. Does this apply to turning on a microwave? Well, in my mind, it is the same as an electric stove, which is the same as a gas stove. So I don't see any difference in there. Again, you're using electricity to heat something, which is exactly what you're doing with a wood fire. Let's go to the other side of this coin, which is light. You use a wood fire for light. You also burn a candle or a oil lamp for light. This is forbidden specifically by the scripture, which means that you have to light your candle before Shabbat starts, right? So does that mean that you can't light a gas lamp? Well, that's starting a fire, so that is definitely falls into this same category, okay? But again, there's only a turn of a knob for a gas fire. It's hardly any work, okay? But what about an electric fire or an electric lamp? Okay, so to me, that's the same as a gas lamp. It's for the same purpose. To me, it's the same thing. Now, they do use timers in Jewish tradition to turn on lamps at certain times so that you don't have to do that, so that you are not starting a fire. You are starting it when you set the timer prior to Shabbat. And so that works. To me, an electric light, an electric stove, and a microwave, all of that fits into this prohibition against starting a fire. But again, you need to have consensus in your congregation if you're going to implement that in your congregation. If you don't get a consensus, you're going to have to leave that to personal interpretation. Okay, so this is the first issue on applying these commands to life. Let's jump down to this other section on electricity. Let's see. Oh, driving a car. Okay, driving a car. When you start a car, the spark plug starts sparking and you are starting many fires. Thus, it is a violation of this command to start a fire to drive your car on Shabbat. As a result, the rabbis say that you can only go about a half mile on Shabbat. It's a easy walking distance, in other words. And so what they do is they will buy or rent a place to stay near a synagogue so that they can walk to synagogue and not have to drive a car. And they actually have laws in Israel about not having buses operate on Shabbat. Okay, stuff like that. So they're trying to accomplish that issue. However, there is a precedence issue, and that is the whole point of Shabbat is for you to have activities with God. And this would include activities with your congregation, meaning that the whole point of Shabbat includes going to a meeting with your congregation on Shabbat, which means that if you are a long distance from your meeting and you have to drive to it, precedence is going to tell us that we have to do that. Again, the best solution is a solution where you can do both, where you can get to your Shabbat meeting and not start a spark plug, which means that you would have to move to a place that was next to your meeting. And that's why Yeshua said that when you, as an apostle, you go out, you stay find one worthy person and you stay in their house the whole time that you are discipling. Meaning that you're going to only disciple people in that local area, and that means that they can walk to the meeting. Okay? So he is accommodating this particular issue also. Okay, so another issue that is brought up is electricity. The rabbinical definition of work, which is first mentioned in Genesis 2, where it's talking about the Shabbat idea, refers to the creation in Genesis 1. And so they say that work is creative work, meaning that if you flip a switch, you're doing creative work, and so you should not be doing that. Now, we have already talked about the idea that an electric light or an electric stove would probably be the application of starting a fire. This idea of work being a creative work is from Scripture. It's an application of Scripture, but again, this is not something that probably everyone will agree to in the congregation, so it has to be left up to personal application. Personally, I don't see a problem with flipping an electric switch. For example, they use this on elevators. If you're in Israel or in some of the places where they have a large Jewish society, they have elevators that are just set on a cycle prior to Shabbat so that you don't have to hit the switch for it because of this electrical idea. Okay, that accommodates both ideas, so I think that that is a good idea. I personally don't think that all electricity is an issue, but certainly starting a fire for heat or for light would definitely follow into the starting a fire issue. Another issue, an application that comes up is water heater. If you turn on the hot water on your sink, you are starting a fire because if you have a gas water heater, that gas water heater is going to come on because you have turned on the hot water. And so what they do is they put hot water in the sink and then cover it with tin foil in order to keep it warm so that you can do the dishes afterwards. The other option, of course, is just rinsing them off with cold water and putting them into the dishwasher. And again, if it's an electric hot water heater, to me, it's the same thing. So that's a concern that you would have to use your own personal application for. So that gives you first little bit of application concerning starting a fire, and to me it applies to electrical devices that heat and light, and so that would be an application to consider. If you have the stove on, if you turn the stove on prior to Shabbat, then it can be on. Having a light on before Shabbat, you can allow that to be on during Shabbat. And that is an application of this particular principle. So, something to think about and to discuss.